All right, let's get into it. Today, we're jumping into a really intense part of history from the book of 2 Kings. We're going to see how two sister kingdoms, tied together by history and faith, can totally fall apart at the exact same time. But here's the twist. One of them just kind of rots slowly from the inside out, while the other one, well, it completely implodes in this whirlwind of violence and coups. So let's break down this tale of two kingdoms. Okay, so on the one hand, you've got Judah down in the south. And if you're just looking at the surface, it seems totally stable. I mean, one king on the throne for over half a century. But underneath, it's this slow, quiet decay. And then you've got Israel in the north, which just descends into absolute chaos, a complete spiral of assassinations. They're both headed to the same place, total collapse. But man, are they taking two wildly different roads to get there. Now, to really get a grip on why everything went so wrong so fast, you have to understand what was happening right before. See, Israel had just come off this long, really prosperous 40-year reign under a king named Jeroboam II. But when he died, it didn't create a smooth transition. It left a huge power vacuum. And just as that happened, this sleeping giant to the east, the Assyrian Empire, starts waking up under a brand new, super aggressive leader. Seriously, the timing could not have been worse. So let's start in the southern kingdom, Judah. If you were living there at this time, you probably felt pretty safe, you know? On the outside, things looked good, stable even. 52 years. Just think about that. That's how long their king, Azariah, you might also know him as Uzziah, was on the throne. We're talking more than half a century with one guy in charge. That's the textbook definition of stability, right? Well, that's the illusion. That's the trap. And here's where we find the root of the problem in Judah. King Azariah, he did the right thing, officially. He supported the one true temple in Jerusalem, but he turned a blind eye to what was really happening with the people, this widespread worship at all these unauthorized local shrines, the so-called high places. These places were a huge problem because they mixed true faith with all sorts of pagan rituals. And by letting them operate for decades, the king basically allowed a deep spiritual rot to set in and become totally normal. And that spiritual compromise, it eventually came back to haunt the king personally. The book of 2 Chronicles tells us his pride got the best of him, and he was struck with leprosy as a divine judgment. This forced him into isolation for the rest of his life. His son, Jotham, had to take over and run the kingdom. Suddenly, that stable facade starts cracking, and you can see the weakness that was hiding underneath all along. So, when Azariah finally died, the whole government didn't fall apart. The power transfer to his son Jotham was actually pretty smooth. But, and this is the key, that stability was incredibly fragile. The nation was just papering over these massive foundational cracks. The walls were still standing, sure, but the very foundation was rotting away. Okay, let's pivot and head north to Israel, where the story is the complete opposite. There's no slow decay here. Nope. This is all about speed, brutality, and just a total systemic implosion. 6 months. That's it. That is how long the new king, Zechariah, the son of that long-reigning Jeroboam II, actually lasted on the throne. Can you believe that? After 40 years of stability, the kingdom's political rot just became lethal in half a year. And this was the kind of atmosphere in the north. You had prophets like Amos walking around, and their warnings weren't these vague threats about the distant future anymore. No, the message was blunt, it was direct. Judgment isn't coming, it's already here. And that judgment, it arrived with shocking brutality. Zechariah wasn't killed in some secret palace plot. A guy named Shallum murdered him before the people, right out in the open for everyone to see. And that single act, it didn't just kill a king. It absolutely shattered any leftover shred of royal authority or legitimacy. What's even crazier is that this assassination was the fulfillment of a prophecy made 100 years earlier. God had promised King Jehu that his dynasty would sit on the throne for 4 generations. Well, Zechariah was the 4th. The promise was kept, and now the grace period was officially over. So what happens next? The assassin, Shallum, he grabs the throne for a grand total of 1 month. 30 days. The kingdom was now cycling through leaders faster than the seasons. The whole thing was just accelerating into a nosedive. And you have to see, this wasn't just random chaos. This became the new political playbook. In Israel, power didn't come from God or from lawful succession anymore. It came from the sharp end of a sword. The blueprint was simple. See the crown, kill the king, take the throne. Brute force was the only law that mattered now. Right in the middle of this political nightmare, you have the prophets Amos and Hosea, and they're providing the why behind the what. They're basically giving a divine commentary on the events, explaining that this isn't just politics, these are spiritual consequences playing out in real time. Hosea's message is just devastatingly simple. He says God had nothing to do with this. These men making themselves kings, Shalom and the ones who came after him, they were just acting on their own. They were illegitimate rulers, born out of pure ambition and violence, and they were driving the nation straight off a cliff, completely outside of God's will. And Amos's message? It was even more final. When a prophet uses a phrase like this, for 3 transgressions and for 4, it's like a divine judge banging a gavel and saying the cup of sin is overflowing. A line had been crossed, God's patience had finally run out, and the consequences were now irreversible. They were locked in. So, what do we take away from all this? What does this story of 2 collapsing kingdoms really tell us about how a nation dies? Not just with a bang, but sometimes with a long, slow whimper. I mean, this visual pretty much says it all. On one side, you have Judah's long, deceptive 52-year reign, and on the other, Israel's collapse is so fast it's barely a blip on the chart. It's the difference between a terminal illness and a sudden, fatal accident. But either way, the end result is the same. So the takeaways here are pretty clear. First, stability on the surface can be a total lie, just masking a deep spiritual sickness. Second, that kind of rapid, violent change isn't a sign of strength, it's the sign of a system that's already dead. And ultimately, it doesn't really matter if the rot is slow or fast. Either way, it hollows out a nation from the inside, leaving it completely defenseless against the real dangers waiting right outside its borders. For the northern kingdom of Israel, these events weren't just some political crisis. This was it. This was the beginning of the end. The chaos we see in Kings 15, that's the sound of a clock starting to tick down to their final destruction and exile. And that leaves us with this really haunting question, doesn't it? This chapter shows us a nation in absolute freefall, tearing itself apart while ignoring every single warning sign. It forces you to ask, when a nation has gone this far down the wrong path, is there really any time left on the clock at all?